Oh, forgot to bring up my screen share. Whoops. There we go. Well, welcome back, folks, to another episode of the American Civil War. We are talking about 1863. So let's kind of look at what we talked about last week, maybe. Hmm. Now, I'm just having all sorts of technical problems here today. Hang on here. Let me try it again. There we go. Okay. Well, last week we looked at how the United States Congress continued to be far-sighted enough that even in the midst of the Civil War, they were passing important legislation that would have an impact upon the country, particularly the West, after the Civil War. And we specifically looked at you know, three different acts. We looked first of all at the Homestead Act of 1862, which of course provided that anyone over the age of 18, male or female, this was kind of a new one, would be allowed to homestead 160 acres on government land. They had to live on it for 5 years and improve it. But of course, that was just a huge act that allowed for the settlement of the West. We also saw how they passed the Morrill Act, which gave each state 30,000 acres of land, which they could use or sell to establish what were known as land grant colleges. And these were specifically designed for the lower and the middle classes. A lot of them would have the designation of agriculture and mechanical, A&M. And so if you see a university, there still exists, Texas A&M, uh, a lot of universities still carry that designation with them, and these were specifically designed to help the lower and middle classes. And finally, of course, there was the Transcontinental Railroad Act, which just had a huge impact on the settlement of the West. Well, as the third year of the Civil War progressed, we looked primarily last week at the siege of Vicksburg with Grant, how he set about for about 5 weeks, about 4 months, sieging Vicksburg, Mississippi, which was it was called the Gibraltar of the West. It guarded the Mississippi River. You were never going to have complete control of the Western theater without Vicksburg falling. That's just all there was to it. You had to take Vicksburg. It was thought to be impenetrable. No one thought that it could actually be taken. But Grant, after several delays and after several false attempts, finally was able, the day after the Battle of Gettysburg, to uh, make Vicksburg fall. Huge victory, folks. It's often overlooked because of Gettysburg, but the campaign of Vicksburg was one of the most important battles of the Civil War. In fact, a lot of people would argue it was actually more important than Gettysburg. It's just that Gettysburg is the better known of the two. Of course, all the time he was doing this, the general staff, Halleck and John Carlos Buell and some of these people like this were backbiting Grant. They didn't like this upstart, and he was kind of an upstart. He'd been in the army before, but he had to leave because of alcoholism, and he had apparently pretty much conquered that. But they didn't like the idea that Grant was getting all this attention, and so they started an actual campaign of rumor mongering, trying to get him dismissed, even though he was winning battles. That it was more important to them to actually get rid of him so they would stand out. And remember, Lincoln got so frustrated over this that he actually had the Secretary of War send a a member of his staff out to Mississippi, Vicksburg, to check on it and see just exactly what was going on. And he wrote back and told Lincoln that, hey, there's nothing to this. The man is a complete professional. I never saw him one time under the influence of alcohol. And remember, Lincoln said, that's it. We're not hearing any more of it. And the old story, whether it's true or not, is he told the Secretary of War to buy a barrel of whiskey for each one of his generals that Grant supposedly drank and send it to him if that's what it'd take to make them fight. And finally, we looked at the life of General William Tecumseh Sherman, who was coming into his own. He had a rough start too in the Civil War. In fact, in case you remember, he actually had to leave the Army for a little bit because what we would call today post-traumatic stress disorder. But at that point in time, they said he went insane. And he just, he really had a really rough start. But then he kind of got over that, and he ended up being, next to Grant, probably the most effective leader of the military. So that's what we did last week. So let's go back to the Eastern campaign now and kind of catch up on it in the spring and see what was going on there. Remember, when we last left the Eastern campaign, the Army of the Potomac had been placed under the command of Ambrose Burnside. He had replaced McClellan, George McClellan. Lincoln had finally had enough of him, and he said, I'm through with the guy. He won't fight. He's great at getting an army ready to fight, but he will not fight. So he put Ambrose Burnside in charge of it, and he gave me specific orders. I expect you to fight. Well, Burnside probably made a mistake. He took that too literally, because remember, in December of 1862, he tried to attack Lee's forces at Fredericksburg, Virginia, and just got beaten to a pulp. He just wasn't ready. His army wasn't ready after Antietam. It was not a good decision on his part. He was doing what he thought he supposedly was going to do, but it just didn't work out. Well, the result was that Burnside started looking around for somebody to blame. And because, when you get defeated, if you're a military man, you always want somebody else to take the blame, right? You love success, you hate, defeat has, a thousand is an orphan. Well, he settles on Joe Hooker. Joe Hooker is his dreaded enemy and one of his subordinates. And he begins a campaign against Hooker. He basically goes to, Lincoln, and he tells him, he says, hey, look, I know I got beat at Fredericksburg, but it wasn't really my fault. And in all honesty, a lot of military historians say that he really wasn't at fault for the loss. A lot of his subordinates didn't do their job very well. But he went to Lincoln, he said, you either let me fire some of my subordinates, or else, I'm going. I'm going to resign. Well, Lincoln, at this point, was totally frustrated. After all, Burnside is his fourth general in charge of the Army of the Potomac in 2 years. There was, first of all, McDowell, and then McClellan, and then Pope, and now Burnside. And he says, fine, go, leave. Who does he appoint as head of the Army of the Potomac now? Fighting Joe Hooker, the very man that Burnside said was responsible for the defeat at Fredericksburg. Of course, a lot of people wonder why exactly Lincoln appointed Hooker. Remember, his nickname was Fighting Joe. I guess he probably thought maybe this guy's a fighter. And he had a reputation to some degree as a fighter. Well, Burnside was just totally dismayed. He just couldn't believe that Lincoln actually accepted his resignation and placed his dreaded enemy, in the position. Burnside was ended up being sent to the Department of Ohio. He got a little bit of trouble there. Eventually, he gets brought back to the East in 1864, and he does a pretty good job in a subordinate position with Grant and Meade. And so, Burnside really wasn't that bad a general. He was actually a very good guy. His troops liked him. He was probably a pretty good general. He just wasn't in the right position at the right time as such. So Burnside is out. Now Joe Hooker is the fifth head of the Army of the Potomac. Well, Joe Hooker is a story in himself. I mean, Joe Hooker is one of these guys that you can read books about and just, he's an amazing man. That's all there is to it. He's a very interesting man to read about. He was from Massachusetts. He was a Yankee, went to West Point, wasn't any big genius. He graduated about middle of his class. He did have a history of fighting. He had fought in the Seminole Wars. He had fought in the Mexican War. And then he served under McClellan. He was kind of a protege of McClellan during the Peninsular Campaign, the Second Battle of Bull Run, Antietam. He was there at Fredericksburg. And he was such an aggressive general in terms of waging battle that he got this nickname, Fighting Joe Hooker. And so Fighting Joe Hooker was now the head of the Army of the Potomac. Unfortunately, there was another side to Joe Hooker. Joe Hooker was kind of loose morally. Well, let's put it this way: he was a lot more than kind of loose morally. One of the historians that wrote about him said that his headquarters was a combination of barroom and brothel. In fact, the case, there are the stories that, the many prostitutes that usually followed these armies, and there were lots of them. There were so many of them following Hooker's army that is exactly where the name Hooker came from. This is the nickname for prostitutes, and that's the story is that they gained their nickname from Fighting Joe Hooker. Don't know. He was also a political schemer. He just, he was very much always trying to gain the advantage over his political opponents and his fellow generals. So he set up this notorious kind of political network of proteges that he used to kind of launch into political attacks upon his enemies. One of them was a man by the name of Daniel Sickles. You will hear more about Daniel Sickles in the near future. He was his nickname was the America's Scoundrel. He's quite the guy himself. Okay, so you can see that Fighting Joe Hooker has some pluses and some minuses. On the plus side, besides being a pretty aggressive general, in all fairness to him, his soldiers loved him, and not just because he allowed all the prostitutes to follow the army. They loved him because he actually instituted some pretty significant reforms, things like improving daily rations. He improved his sanitary conditions, hospital care. He kind of developed an effective intelligence unit. He kind of adopted a furlough system to give people a chance to go off on what's known as R&R, rest and relaxation. As a result, desertion, which had been really, really high in the Army of the Potomac, kind of ceased to exist at this point. So, he had some positive things going for him. Even though he had this part barroom, part brothel as his headquarters, as a general, he actually did a pretty good job. So he immediately decides he's going to attack Lee again. Lee is, after Fredericksburg, is still encamped at Fredericksburg over the winter. Remember, everybody pretty much goes into winter quarters during the Civil War. Between the months of January and, say, April, after the spring rains, first part of May, they start fighting again. But there's about a 3, 4, 5 month lapse here where they don't do much fighting. You'll have some skirmishes and maybe some reconnaissance motions and all like that. For the most part, the army is just going to winter quarters. Well, he decides he's going to take his army down, and he's going to, once again take the battle to Lee at Fredericksburg. And so that sets the stage for what becomes known as the Battle of Chancellorsville, which occurs between May the 1st and May the 4th. An extremely significant battle, as you will see. You will see that Chancellorsville is just a few miles, probably maximum 10 miles from Fredericksburg to the west. So what happened at the Battle of Chancellorsville? Well, once Hooker was given command of the Army of the Potomac, he decided he was going to attack Lee at Fredericksburg. Now, he had a huge army. He actually outnumbered Lee's army about 2-1. So, Lee was really kind of in a precarious position here because he was able to basically reinforce his army remember the North, that's one of the great advantages that they've got all this manpower to draw from, whereas the South is just, they're really hurting for manpower. Well, the first thing he does, he decides he's going to develop a pincher move, try to trap Lee between two forces. And so he sends his cavalry unit under George Stoneman deep into Lee's rear towards Richmond, thinking, I'm going to distract Lee. At the same time, he divided his own army, sending Sickles to flank Lee from the rear. And so Hooker then will attack him from the front. So he's kind of got a pretty good thing going here. He's got Stoneman headed towards Richmond to try to distract and divert maybe some of Lee's army. He's got Sickles coming in from the west, and he's going to come in from the east. It's a pretty good, tactical move on his part. So, he's got some good things going. Unfortunately, it didn't turn out for Hooker. First of all, Lee was able to beat back Hooker's army, who was attacking him from the east. And he used Stonewall Jackson to do that. Stonewall Jackson was still there under Lee's command. And Jackson is just a superior fighting general. That's just all there is to it, folks. He was, without a doubt, he very well may have been the best general of the Civil War. That's just all there is to it. He was able to defeat Hooker. And then Lee turned his attention back to the west and ends up just completely annihilating Sickles' army and Hooker's army. The result was, even though he is outnumbered 2-1, he ends up winning this battle. And it's to the dismay of all the Union people. They just cannot believe this has happened because Hooker was fighting Joe Hooker. He had him outnumbered 2-1. This has often been called Lee's perfect battle. Everything went right, Now, to be fair to Hooker, some people said he just lost his nerve. Some people said that he failed to attack at the right times and that he just lost his nerve. On the other hand, some people say, no, what happened was that he actually got almost decapitated, by a cannonball, and he suffered a concussion, and he just was unable to make rational command decisions at a very critical time in the battle. But regardless of whether it was a loss of nerves or it was a concussion, Hooker did not do what he needed to do to defeat Lee. And Lee, despite being outnumbered 2-1, ends up winning this battle. But there's a downside. And folks, it is a huge downside for the Confederacy. Stonewall Jackson is killed. Stonewall Jackson, Lee's right-hand man, his best general, is actually killed by his own men accidentally. There are a few people out there that claim he was actually what's called fragged. Jackson was a great general, and most of his troops would follow him anywhere. But he was also extremely hard-nosed, and there were a lot of his army soldiers that did not like him, even though he was this great general and everybody, supposedly would follow him anywhere. He had a considerable number of his own forces. He had a lot of soldiers shot for insubordination and desertion. He had some hanged. He was a very rigid general. But the general account is that Jackson had been out at night doing some surveillance, which was pretty common for him, and that coming back into camp, some of the sentry guards saw him thinking he was a Union spy and shot him accidentally. Ended up having to have his left arm amputated. Now, at that point, he survives that. Everything, looks okay. I mean, he survives the amputation. He's taken to a hospital. He has surgery. He seemed to be doing okay. And then he gets infected and he gets sepsis. And 7 days later, he dies. Not from the actual amputation, but from the infection, which was, again, pretty a common occurrence. many people survived the surgery in the Civil War battles. They didn't survive, you know, the infection rate afterwards. Uh, Lee is just devastated. Lee says, you know, Jackson may have lost his left arm, but I've lost my right arm. It was just a tremendous loss. Things never go right for the South again after this. This is maybe one of the most critical times in the Civil War because he never finds anybody to quite replace Stonewall Jackson. You know, there's people out there that do a good job, but they never really replace him. This is kind of a map. You can see Fredericksburg is here, and Chancellorsville is about 10 miles west, and most of the battle was fought, first of all, here, and then was fought over here at Chancellorsville. So, by the way, this is a great picture, folks. This is a picture taken of the Union soldiers preparing to take part in the Battle of Chancellorsville. You very seldom see this kind of picture from the Civil War. Most photographs of the Civil War are taken kind of either posed photographs in camp or you see photographs taken after a battle. You very seldom see a photograph where the soldiers are preparing to go to battle. And this is a group of Union soldiers that are preparing to attack at Chancellorsville. It's a fantastic photo. I look at those faces and I think of all those poor souls and what they must have gone through. I think of my great grandfather, and what he must have gone through at this time. It's just sometimes it's really a fantastic photo to me. You just wonder how many of these people actually survived this battle because we know there was a great loss of life on both sides. So, great photo. Well, what happens after Battle of Chancellorsville? Well, Lee once again decides he's going to go on the offensive. It's springtime. He's beat back Burnside at Fredericksburg in December of '62. Now he beat back Hooker at Chancellorsville in May. And Lee is pretty much kind of feeling full of himself at this point. He's kind of got the idea that he's kind of got an invincible army because he really should not have won the Battle of Chancellorsville. And he's kind of beginning to think, well, I must be pretty good, and my troops are just kind of invincible. So he decides he's once again going to take the attack north, like he had earlier when he tried to go into Maryland and got defeated kind of at Antietam back in the fall of 1862. Meanwhile, the North is just beside themselves. Lincoln is just like, this is what they said. Lincoln said, my God, what will the country say? Radical congressmen like Charles Sumner said, it's all lost, folks, we're done. That it had got to the point where they didn't know for sure if they could defeat Lee. And Lee is to the point where he doesn't think he can be defeated. And so he decides, I'm headed north and I'm going to take this battle up to Pennsylvania and we're going to win this thing. We're finally going to win it. Now, Davis wasn't too sure about this. Davis was a little bit more cautious than Lee was. Davis kind of wanted Lee to take some of his forces and go out west and tackle Grant. He said, this is the guy you need to worry about. Grant out west is winning battles. Maybe you need to take your army and go out there and take care of Grant. And Lee was like, no problem. I can take care of Grant. Grant's a nobody. I've read biographies of Lee, and he had a kind of he was kind of derisive towards Grant in the early years. He didn't think much of him. So, what happens as they head north? Lee decides he's going to head to Harrisburg, Pennsylvania. That's deep, deep into Union territory. He thinks, I'm going to go up here and I'm going to win a great big battle in the north, in the Union held territory, and I'm going to be so destructive. My army is going to win, and we are going to end this war, and the Confederacy will be able to go their own way. Slavery will be preserved. We will be able to have our own country, and the North can just do without us. So what he does is he sends Jeb Stuart's cavalry north. It is attacked by Alfred Pleasonton, a Union cavalry officer. This ends up being the biggest battle of the cavalry in the Civil War, over 20,000. Can you imagine that? 20,000 cavalry officers fighting each other in a battle, the Battle of Brandy Station, Virginia, the biggest one of the Civil War. Casualty was huge. I just, I can't wrap my head around seeing all these men and horses involved in a gigantic battle like this. But this was a battle of about 20,000 troops, biggest cavalry battle of the Civil War. The battle was kind of inconclusive. Nobody really won, nobody really lost. But what it did do was kind of keep Lee from knowing exactly where Hooker's army was, because Hooker at this point is still in charge. Hooker is still in charge of the Battle of the Potomac, pardon me, the Army of the Potomac. And so at this point, Lee is headed north. Hooker is in charge of the army that's supposedly going to stop him. Now, Hooker, just like all these other generals, was trying to figure somebody out that was, at fault. It couldn't possibly be me. I'm too great a general to let this happen to me. So he starts looking for scapegoats. And he can't blame Burnside because Burnside's out west now. And so he basically turns into a clone of McClellan. He tells Lincoln and he tells the Secretary of War, well, I was outnumbered. He wasn't. He had he had an army of 2-1, larger than Lee. He said, I needed reinforcements. And then he turned into Burnside and said, well, either you give me more reinforcements or I'm going to resign. And Lincoln said, fine, you're out. And so Lincoln dismisses Hooker as the head of the Army of the Potomac after one battle. And he looks around and he says, who in the world am I going to place in charge of the Army of the Potomac? He settles upon a man by the name of General George Meade. George Meade was an engineer. George Meade had not really had a lot of combat experience. His major effort at the beginning of the war was actually to kind of reinforce the forts and all around Washington, D.C. He becomes the sixth leader of the Army of the Potomac in about 2 years. He ends up remaining as the head of the Army of the Potomac for the remainder of the Civil War. He ends up being a pretty good general. Now, there's a caveat to that, which we'll see. He's kind of got Grant looking over his shoulder because Grant is going to come back east eventually. But, at least in the beginning, Meade is in charge, and he is going to win the Battle of Gettysburg, which is a gigantic victory for the West, for the Union. So who was General George Meade? Well, General George Meade was born in Spain, of all things. His father was a wealthy merchant, and he happened to be in Spain at the time that he was born. He was still an American citizen because his family they didn't live there, so he was an American citizen. Graduated from West Point. He saw action in the Seminole Wars and the Mexican War, just like a lot of these generals did. But he really was more of an engineer than he was a combat soldier. And like I said, when the Civil War began, he was actually in charge of building defenses around Washington, D.C. He did see action a little bit later. They did put him out in the battle, but he was kind of not really, you don't hear him. In fact, we haven't mentioned him. He really didn't have much to do. He's Peninsular Campaign, the Second Bull Run, Antietam, Fredericksburg, Chancellorsville. He was at all these, but he really had not been an instrumental person in any of these battles. But Lincoln looks at him, and Halleck says, hey, he's a pretty good general. Maybe we need to put him in charge. And so Lincoln said, well, why not? I sure haven't found anybody else that'll do the job except Grant out west. And so he appoints Meade to be in charge of the Army of the Potomac. And he basically tells him, you take over this army that's headed north to intercept Lee. He is just barely in charge of the Army of the Potomac when the Battle of Gettysburg takes place. He really didn't have, a lot to do with the preparations of the Battle of Gettysburg. He's he's kind of an irascible old dude. In fact, his nickname was Old Snapping Turtle. They said that he was just had a absolutely terrible temper, and it was violent at times. He said he was also tenacious, like a snapping turtle. Once he grabbed hold of something, he did not let go. Uh, that would kind of prove a compliment to Grant when Grant comes east. These two work pretty well together. They had their differences, but Grant becomes in charge of the whole Union Army in the latter part of 1863, and Meade kind of serves under him. Grant travels with the Army of the Potomac. He doesn't stay in Washington as a desk officer. I'm getting a little ahead of myself here, but just to kind of give you an idea of what George Meade was into. So I had hoped that we would get to the Battle of Gettysburg this week, but we're not going to do it. We're going to, because I want to make sure that we have a full 45 minutes to talk about the Battle of Gettysburg, because it's a 3 day long battle, and it is the battle of the Civil War. So I want to make sure that I cover as much detail as I need to. But let's kind of set the stage for next week. You can see where Gettysburg is. I'm going to bet there's some of you out there have been to Gettysburg. I've been to Gettysburg. It's on the kind of the Pennsylvania Maryland border. It's up in the mountains. It's kind of Blue Ridge Mountains. It's up here. Probably maybe 70 miles from Washington D.C. or so. So it's a pretty small village actually. But Gettysburg is not a big place. Probably more known anymore, besides the battle, for the home of General Eisenhower when he was president and when he retired as president. This is where he had his home at Gettysburg, Pennsylvania. So, what about the Battle of Gettysburg? And I'm not going to get into it, but we're going to set the stage today. Well, there were several turning points in the Civil War. We've already mentioned this before. Vicksburg was a turning point. Antietam was kind of a turning point. But this is the turning point. This is the single most important battle of the Civil War. There's absolutely no doubt about it, because this is the battle that turns the tide for the Union. It is an absolute defeat for Lee. At this point, after the Battle of Gettysburg, Grant comes east, and Grant and Lee begin their, probably year and a half long battle against each other. So it is absolutely the most important battle of the Civil War, fought between July 1st and 3rd, 1863. Remember, after Lee's perfect victory at Chancellorsville, he heads north. He's got a whole brand new corps commanders with him. Jackson is gone now. Stonewall Jackson is dead. I keep saying Andrew Jackson. Stonewall Jackson is dead. So he has to replace Stonewall Jackson. And the guys he replaces him with, if you can actually say that's the right word, are a man by the name of A.P. Hill and Richard Ewell. They're not bad generals. They're experienced, but they're no Stonewall Jackson. That's just all there is to it. He did have James Longstreet. James Longstreet was his second in command now, since Jackson was gone. And Longstreet had been with him for most of the Civil War up to this point. He did have his cavalry commander, Jeb Stuart, who, if not the best cavalry officer in the South, pretty close. Probably Nathan Bedford Forrest was actually a better cavalry officer. Jeb Stuart was pretty good. He had about a 70,000 man army. So Lee is headed north with 70,000 soldiers. Now, he does the same thing he does before the Battle of Antietam. He knows he's going to have to live off the land because he is preparing to go deep into Union territory. I mean, he's headed towards Harrisburg, which is about halfway up through Pennsylvania on the eastern side. And so he's going to go to Harrisburg, the capital, and he's going to take it to the north in his mind. He thinks at this point that he is invincible and that his army is invincible. So he separates his army out into 4 different parts. Lee has a part, Hill has a part, Ewell has a part, Longstreet has a part. On top of that, he's got Stuart out there. So he's actually got 5 different legs of the army moving north. The same thing he did at Antietam. I'm sure this time he makes sure that his orders aren't lost like they were at Antietam. The problem was he didn't quite know where Hooker's army was or what he thinks is Hooker's army. He doesn't learn until right before the battle that Hooker has been removed and he has been replaced with George Meade. In the biographies I've read of Lee, he had quite a bit of respect for Meade. He knew Meade pretty well, and he knew that he was going to have a pretty big battle on his hands with Meade. Um, he was he was kind of in the same mode as Lee was. He was an engineer. He kind of had this same mindset. Meade had 93,000 men. So Lee's got 70,000 men, but they're all out into 5 different little armies. Meade has 93,000 men, and they're all together. And on top of that, Lee doesn't know where he's at. He has sent Stuart out there to find him. That's what Stuart is supposed to be doing, is roaming around out ahead of him, trying to figure out where what he thinks is Hooker's army is. Too late to find out it's Meade's army. Uh, so what happened is they end up coming together at the little town of Gettysburg on the Pennsylvania-Maryland line. Lee was shocked. This is not what he wanted to do. He did not want to fight a battle at Gettysburg. It was not what he wanted. Lee liked to pick his battlegrounds, and he was not prepared to fight a battle at Gettysburg. But he really didn't have a choice, because when he figured out what was going on, he figured out that Meade's army was there, and he thought, well, I don't have a choice. I'm going to have to fight now. Uh, and again, he had this mindset about him that his army was invincible. And at this point in time, that he really did not believe his army could be defeated. He really believed. You can see this. You can read quotes from him. He actually thought that he was, invincible at this point. Call it hubris, whatever you want to call it. So he immediately sends word to Longstreet and Ewell and Hill to bring their armies to Gettysburg, because he figures out this is where we're going to have to fight. He can't find Stuart. Stuart's out here roaming around somewhere, nowhere to be found. So the first part of July, you've got General James Longstreet, you've got General A.P. Hill, you've got General Richard Ewell. These are the subordinates. These are the field commanders under Lee. And they are the men that will do much of the fighting at Gettysburg. Lee will be there, and Lee will give the commands, and he will tell them where to go and all. But it's these 3 guys that will end up doing the majority of the fighting, their armies. On the Union side, Meade actually doesn't get there until a little bit, because he's just been appointed. You've got General John Reynolds, you've got General Winfield Scott Hancock, and you've got Hooker's old buddy Daniel Sickles, the guy, the America's scoundrel, and we'll talk more about him, next week. So these are the 6 men that are going to be doing the majority of the fighting at the Battle of Gettysburg. Lee will be there in charge. Meade will get there, and he'll be in charge. But it's these 6 guys that are going to do the majority of the fighting. So I'm going to stop at this point. This is where we're at now. And next week, I promise you, we're going to fight the Battle of Gettysburg. It is so important. It's such a big battle that I know you want to be with us and that you want to hear about it, because it's a gigantic battle. There's all sorts of good information out there about the Battle of Gettysburg. There's many good books about it. Killer Angels is one of the great books about the Battle of Gettysburg. Of course, if you're into movies, there is a very long movie about the Battle of Gettysburg, which is probably as good a movie as you're going to see about any battle in the Civil War. It's really a fairly good movie. So at this point, I hope you've enjoyed this. I want to encourage you to keep on lifelong learning. That's become my you know, thing right now. I just see how important it is for us to keep that brain working, because if we let it slide, it goes down pretty fast. So I appreciate you guys being with us. I hope you've learned something, Dave. I hope you enjoyed yourself, and I will see you next week.